I'm Laura Harmon. I'm managing the UDO project.
Looks like may have lost Laura, possibly. Be sure. Andrew, can you pick up here? I think Laura may have dropped off mistakenly.
Sure. Thank you everybody for joining today. We lost Laura, our fearless leader. She will be back, I hope, depending on connectivity. But thank you all for coming today. We are having this meeting today to go over several key important changes and topics for frequent users. So frequent users of the UDO are those who are designing, developing, using the development ordinance with any frequency. So there's a lot to cover today. We have a lot of slides, and I don't know who I'm supposed to throw it to next. Is somebody wanna?
I can take it, Andrew. Thank you.
Okay.
For today's meeting, our UDO staff will be narrating the presentation. And if you need clarification on anything presented today, you can go ahead and comment that in the chat box. We're going to be attempting to respond to the questions and comments at the end of the meeting, but we have quite a bit to cover. So we might not be able to get to everything that's posed, but we will do our very best. We thank you all for being here with us today. So the purpose of our meeting here is to highlight some changes to development regulations set forth in the draft UDO that could impact development and design in Charlotte. We're going to be focusing more on high-level changes rather than site-specific standards today. And as we move through, we're going to try to incorporate some of the questions that we received by registrants, but the focus really is going to be, like I said, on those high-level changes in each of sort of like the sections of the UDO. One of the areas that we received several questions about were short-term rentals. We won't be covering that too much today. We will be focusing that on a topic of upcoming conversation in February or early March specifically. And we won't be speaking to any, like I said, site-specific questions today. We just really don't have enough time. So this slide may be familiar to several of you who have joined us for virtual conversations before, but this slide outlines our key UDO schedule dates. This reflects the recent schedule adjustment that extends our comment period until March 18th. We will be reviewing the comments that we receive on a rolling basis, and we've already begun to do so, and we will continue to and incorporate those into the second UDO draft set for release in May of 2022. The schedule, as you see here, aims for a City Council public hearing and Planning Committee recommendation in June. And then that is all leading to a hopeful target adoption in July. So what is the connection? One of the major roles of the UDO is to provide the regulations needed to implement the vision established by the City Council adopted comprehensive plan. So we are taking the regulations from 8 different places and updating them and consolidating them into one singular development ordinance. Most folks here on this call are probably familiar with the zoning ordinance, but and several others, but this includes the subdivision, trees, streets and sidewalks, post-construction, stormwater, floodplain, and the others that you see pictured above. So like I said, not only are we working to align the development regulations with one another, but also aligning them with council adopted policies. Why develop a UDO? So like I said, it is the primary regulatory tool to implement the comprehensive plan. Also to create more predictability for future development in Charlotte, as well as to aligning those development regulations so they work more seamlessly together. A couple of other reasons: to create a more user-friendly ordinance, simplifying terms and creating common language across the document, and increasing the use of graphics. And then lastly, also to comply with North Carolina 160D legislation. So the UDO is essentially comprised of 5 broad buckets outlined here. And so on today's call, we're going to be digging into the major highlights from zoning, stormwater, and natural resources, subdivision, streets, and infrastructure, and administration. Beyond those 5 broad sections, the UDO is organized into 13 parts. As you see here, each part is comprised of 1 or more of the UDO's 40 articles. So what you see on the slide is the more formal organization of the UDO, and it can show you exactly where you might find specific standards or regulations that you're looking for. So for example, general development zoning standards is part 8 of the ordinance and include articles 16 through 22. Is Laura back with us?
I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, somehow I got booted briefly.
Great. Okay. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Laura Harmon, our UDO project manager, to talk some more about the zoning highlights.
Great. Thank you, Mariah. Good afternoon. And again, we're going to go through things that try to touch on a lot of things at a pretty high level. We will do our best to respond to comments that are related to what we're presenting today, or questions, actually. If you've got other comments or questions, please go into the portal that we have set up for comments to be gathered. We have at this point over 600 comments. So as you can imagine, we're spending a lot of time going through those individually and responding to each of those. So now I'll get started with zoning. Typically, Alan Goodwin handles this on our team, the deputy project manager. That he is out. He'll be back with us in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to jump in. So we have a new palette of zoning districts. You'll notice that the names don't look like the zoning districts that we currently have. And real briefly, we have zoning districts that are related to place types. And the place types, where there are 10 different place types, and we have developed zoning districts for all but the parks and preserves, which will fit into the other zoning districts we have. For the neighborhood 1 place type, when hopefully everyone is familiar at this point in time with the place types and the categories, we have 6 zoning districts. For neighborhood 2, which is our higher density residential, we have 3 zoning districts. Next slide. We have 4 specifically what we call employment place types, though we'll have employment in other place types as well. Commercial, which is really where our more auto-oriented uses and design will be. And we have 2 districts there, 3 districts for campuses, 2 for manufacturing and logistics, which is currently named industrial in our district, and 1 for our innovation mixed use place type. And then finally, on the next slide, we have our centers place type. And just to reinforce this, we also have a lot of employment in our centers. Don't want to miss that. But in addition to employment uses, office, retail, we also have residential in these areas, designed to be very walkable, less auto-oriented than commercial districts. And our neighborhood center, we have 1 zoning district, 2 in our community activity centers, and 3 zoning districts for our regional activity center, which also includes Uptown Charlotte. And I forgot to mention, we do also have fall into the centers, our TOD zoning districts. We have 4 districts there. These were adopted a couple of years ago, and we've been using them. So hopefully a lot of you guys are familiar with them. Our overlay and special purpose districts are in addition to our base districts. You can see the list here. We have our current historic district overlay, some new overlays, the cottage court overlay, neighborhood character overlay, and residential infill overlay. We did a session on the neighborhood 1 zoning districts a while back. If you haven't had a chance, that video delves into these overlays more than I will today. Then we are also have a couple of manufactured home districts. One is an overlay and one is a park, manufactured home park. And then we have an airport noise disclosure overlay, which carries also over from our current ordinance. So a question that we are getting from people is, so how do I know what my zoning will be in the future after the UDO is implemented? And all conventional zoning, not conditional or optional, which is a form of conditional or EX, but all of our conventional zoning districts will translate to one of the new UDO districts. And in 3.2 of the ordinance, you can see the translation chart that is up here. This will be the first step in aligning our zoning with the policy map, which maps place types throughout the community. We will be going back and recommending some additional zonings to bring zoning into alignment with place type, the place type policy map. So we will also at that point in time be looking at what is on the ground that is zoned with a conditional district or an optional district. But those will not translate, they will remain in place. Only the conventional zoning will initially translate. Some of the standards that you find in most of the districts, you'll be very familiar with related to the districts, and there are some that are a bit new. So I won't read through all of these, but I will point out that we have used in the TOD districts, build to zones, build to percentage. That may be a bit new if you haven't looked at that before. It would be good to dig into the ordinance and learn a little bit about those. We also have expanded our building articulation standards. We have some of those in our more urban districts now. We've expanded the categories of standards as well as the districts that they apply to. And a lot of this, if you're familiar again with the TOD districts, then we are already using these. Transparency is another thing that's in TOD that we're expanding, and some of the items in building design. I think the other types of standards are the types of standards that you're probably used to using as you're designing a site, but you may want to look at those and see how maybe specifically they changed. And I'll talk about some of that as we go forward. Next slide. A few things just to know about the way that the UDO, draft UDO works, is proposed to work, and that is a little bit different from our current regs, is many of our zoning standards are controlled by the frontage of a property. So if you're on a side of a building along a certain frontage, you'll go to that frontage, go to the standard for that frontage type. Setbacks are an example. Your building setback will depend on what your frontage, and it's typically a street frontage, though not always. It may also be an open space frontage or transit stationary frontage, but your setbacks are controlled by the type of frontage in almost all of the districts. There are 9 frontage types as the ordinances currently draft. Main Street and 4 to 5 Lane Avenue Boulevard are 2 examples of frontage types. And for more information on frontages, you can go to pages 4.3 through 4.6. Another thing to know is that our setbacks are measured in all of the districts except the neighborhood 1 districts from the future back of curb. That's what we do with our current urban districts, but that is different for a lot of the from what we do now for a lot of the other districts. So be aware of that when you're looking at setback. It may look like, wow, that setback is really large compared to our current setback. Well, that's because the setbacks in a lot of districts now are measured from the right-of-way line. In the future, they'll be measured from back of curb. So you have an additional setback, the setback number gets larger because you're including your planting area and your sidewalk in that setback dimension. Places to go for that feature back a curb, Charlotte Streets map for the non-local streets, and for local and collector, there is a standard, goes with each zoning district. And finally, spending a lot of time on this slide, but we'll go faster in a minute. There is a development bonus table that is included, that currently is included in Todd and has been expanded to apply to a number of the other districts. There are height and open space bonuses, and there are a number of actions that can result in a bonus. So affordable housing, business inclusion, I won't read all of these. LEED standards are another one, or different types of high performance construction. And information on that development bonus is found in section 16.3. A little bit different way that we're handling uses in the UDO is we have grouped all the definitions for uses in one place in the ordinance, and they're separated out from the general definitions. And then we have use tables that you can go to. And across the top, if you can see this, there are zoning districts identified, and down the left-hand side of the screen, there are the different uses that are identified, and there will be a definition for each of these uses. You won't have to go into the individual districts and look for uses. You won't have to then go to a separate definition. It will all be in Article 15, and the uses are either allowed basically by right with no conditions, and that would have an X in that cell, or with prescribed conditions, which you'll also find in that chapter, or as a part of a conditional zoning district for a limited number of uses. And then for a grayed out cell, that use is not allowed in that district at all. So a little bit different approach and hopefully easier to follow than our current ordinance. Quickly moving through our neighborhood 1 districts, particularly neighborhood 1, A through E. Important to know, you've probably heard a lot about this, that single family duplex and triplex dwellings are allowed on all lots, quadruplex dwellings on arterials with an affordable housing unit. And then we have an N1F district that allows a couple of other housing types, townhomes and multifamily, under very defined conditions. Also some non-residential uses in neighborhood commercial, but we have eliminated the use of density in the ordinance, and we are using lot sizes. And so for these lots, for our N1 districts, you can put a single family home, a duplex, or a triplex on any lot that meets the lot standards. Next slide. One thing that we've heard a lot about so far are some standards we have for duplexes and triplexes, one of which is the height of the building, or the sidewall height, and that impacts the overall height. I won't go into this in detail, but I want to acknowledge we have gotten a lot of comments on this, whether it is adequate to allow duplexes and triplexes with that sidewall height. It is 12 feet, and that's really the height of the side of your home that you're building, or an average of the height of the adjacent building sidewalls. And we'll be continuing to look at this standard and gathering feedback. So if you have any specific comments, we'd love to hear from you. You can also go higher as you move away from the edge of a property. So kind of technical, little, probably not the best explanation of that. If you dig into this in the ordinance and have comments, we'd love to hear those. Also to be aware of, a couple of development options. We have a conservation residential development that can be used with our N1 districts. This replaces the cluster provisions in our current ordinance. A little bit different approach, but same intent. and then an updated version of our voluntary mixed income bonus provisions. Again, I mentioned these earlier, so I won't go over them again, but we do have 3 overlay districts that do relate specifically to our N1, most of our N1 districts. Parking. So today is a little bit of a lot of things. So going through this parking, we have a new 3-tiered approach that we're proposing. And depending on your zoning district, you fit into one of these 3 tiers. And for the tier 1, which are probably our more auto-oriented districts, there is a minimum off-street parking requirement and no maximum. If you move into tier 2, there's both a minimum and a maximum parking standard. And if you move into tier 3, we have a minimum, there are no parking minimums except for a limited number of uses. And we have also maximum parking. So mostly in tier 3, you're going to see a limit on the amount of parking you can provide, not a requirement for a minimum amount. Next slide. Something else new that you'll find in the UDO are standards for electric vehicle charging stations in section 19.3. This is related to multifamily, certain types of multifamily, residential components of mixed use, hotels, parking lots, and parking structures. Don't count against your parking maximums if you are in a district with parking maximums, and where parking minimums are required, the EV installed spaces count as 2 spaces. So you get actually more bang for your buck if you're actually installing these, as opposed to making the spaces just ready. A little bit more on parking. We do have standards again in Article 19 that talk about the location of an access to surface parking, and that does differ somewhat by zoning districts. There are a few things in this table that we are re-looking at. So again, if you have comments on parking standards, and in this case, in addition, location and access to those spaces, we've heard some comments that some of the standards may not always work. So we'd like you to take a look at those and provide us feedback on those as well. We also have design of parking. This is a carry or an expansion of what is in TOD standards for that. We have options that relate to both your zoning district and your frontage. It's probably for many of you maybe a little small to see on the screen, but you would go look for your zoning district first, and then you would look at the frontage for your zoning district to determine which of the options are available to you as far as design of the parking structures. So this is a little bit different from what we do today. We do have some parking structure design, but this is a little bit different approach. And again, based largely off of what has been done in the TOD districts. Onto landscaping and screening. We have these different types of landscaping and screening. I think that probably nomenclature wise, the biggest thing to understand is that what was formerly called a buffer is now a landscape yard. Next slide. And similar to buffers, we're really doing these to deal with adverse impacts when you have one use that may be very intense or have some impacts adjacent to another or to a less intense use. Really provide a transition between those uses. Next slide. Again, you'll find that we have a lot of charts in the UDO, hopefully easier to find things than reading through a lot of words. But we do for the landscape yards, again, formerly called buffers, we do have, you go and look for your zoning district, then you look at what is your developing use and what is the use that you will be next to. And that will determine what landscape yard standard you have to meet. And we have 3 types of landscape yards, A, B, and C. Some similarity to what is in our current zoning regs, but also updated as far as the standards. So take a look at those. Really trying to make sure that we are including these when we need to, protecting those uses, particularly residential, that probably require the greatest amount of protection, and letting go sometimes of those landscape yards when we really think we don't need the transition that may be in our current ordinance. We also have some conditions, some uses that may have prescribed conditions that also require a landscape yard that is in addition to or different from what is in the charts. But you would find that in the prescribed conditions for those uses. Next slide. And I think this is my last bit, open space requirements. Most of the districts do have open space requirements. What the UDO is talking about as far as open space is really usable open space. So I think some folks think, well, I have a little leftover piece of land over here. Does that count as open space? We're really develop standards to make sure that these are usable, but we have done this in a way that we hope is very flexible, and that you have a lot of places where this open space can go. It doesn't have to be on the ground. It can be on balconies, it can be on patios, it can be on top of buildings. And so we're getting comments on open space. We'd love some more, but that is the intent, is to make sure that we have open spaces in our developments, but that it really meets the needs of the development as well. And that's what the flexibility is for. And then we do have some uses where open space just doesn't make sense and it's not required as well. Next slide. So a little bit more on open spaces. An example, you'll find the chart of what is required for, say, employment and center zoning. And you can go and find your zoning district, find the percentage of the site that is required for open space. And probably a lot of you guys are looking at this and going, wow, 10%. That's 10% if it's on the ground. Yeah, it may be in some cases kind of high, but again, you have a lot of options on where that goes. So take a look at that in conjunction with the percentage requirement. And then 50% of, 50% in a lot of cases of that open space for a lot of types of development has to be public, accessible to the public. We are going back and tweaking some of this and are hearing feedback on this, is when is it really feasible to have open space available to the public. But when you see that number, it's not 50% of your site, it's 50% of your required open space, or 25% of your required open space for mixed use development. Next slide. And I mentioned flexibility. Again, this is something you can go back into the ordinance and look at the allowances, but we do have options for open space to be on decks, galleries, porches, terraces, patios, rooftops, balconies, in a lot of cases. So trying to provide that flexibility to get open space, excuse me, but to have it have a lot of options for where it can go. And with that, I'll turn this over to Andrew Russell.
Thank you. Go to my next slide. So I'll say this before I get too far into my slides. Everything today is going to hit on some very key changes. We already did a virtual conversation on stormwater standards that had a lot of the intent and purpose for what we're doing. This presentation will be primarily about some very key changes and maybe how we're going to approach some of the things that we discussed in that prior meeting. So with that being said, the first component that we wanted to present today was a discussion on Article 24, which is a new chapter on drainage standards. So subdivisions and commercial projects will continue with the current process. So those of you that are familiar with stormwater reviews and permits, the standards are going to continue to apply, and the review process is going to stay pretty similar. So the only difference is that smaller projects are now going to be subject to some more drainage reviews. And so we've gotten some questions about what that means. It's really, we want to stress today though that the drainage plan is kind of going to go through a 3-tiered approach. So if you have minimal or no impact to existing drainage, you're proposing an addition to a house or some sort of yard project that could have impacts. If you're impacting storm drainage or other infrastructure, that would fall into that tier 2. And at that point, when you're impacting existing drainage or changes to drainage infrastructure, or conveying water from a public street, those are going to have a higher level of review and may require would require a design professional to be involved. But we also see that a lot of projects may fall into that tier 1. So we're trying to lay out the process so people are aware that if you aren't having impacts to existing stormwater drainage or site drainage, you generally have a pretty easy permit review as a part of this article. Go to the next slide. The second big change we want to highlight is post-construction stormwater ordinance. Today, we have applicability thresholds based on commercial or residential development that are really very different. You can see it there in the top part of the table. In the UDO, we are going to a consistent lower threshold for all development. So this may result in us seeing more projects, but in general, I think there are a lot of benefits to this approach, and we want to get community feedback on this pretty significant change to our stormwater regulations. And then next slide. And the last two that we want to highlight, or I guess 3, are related to mitigation, natural area, and buffers, water quality buffers. First, on-site compliance for all sites is going to be required. We're removing a lot of the mitigation options that are currently in, I believe the post-construction ordinance. Natural area is a requirement that is currently in our ordinance, but that is going away. We're translating that into the tree article, which does a lot of the things that we really want this area to do. And then thirdly, there's an adjustment to the water quality buffers, which you can see here, 15 feet limitation away from the stream bank is going to be incorporated. Go to the next slide. And then this is sorry, the arrows got messed up there, but the overview of where we're going with the tree preservation article. Real high level, we'll talk about simplified applicability, tree save, going to what we're calling green area, what that means, how we're transitioning from centers, corridors, and wedges. So if you're familiar with the current ordinance, there's a lot of mentions to centers, corridors, or wedges, how that's going to move to place types. And then finally, heritage tree protection, which has been a highly discussed topic in the UDO. The next slide. So what you can see here is the sort of a description of what is the types of development that are going to require compliance with the tree article. So you can see in our current ordinance, there's a lot of sort of nuanced requirements for if you're adding parking spaces or if there's a change to your building facade. In the new UDO, we're taking all that out. We're really going to stick to construction of a principal structure, increased built upon area or building coverage, and then approval of a subdivision. And you can find that in 29.2 of the UDO. Next slide. A lot of information here, a lot of words, but in general, we wanted to talk about exemptions. So today, if you're constructing a single family or duplex structure, you are exempt from the tree ordinance. That is going to continue to apply. We're going to exempt single family and duplex projects like they are today and add triplexes and quadruplexes to that exemption. There will be some, you can see there a little asterisk, there will be some tree planting requirements for single family and duplex projects. And I will add a caveat here that duplexes and single family structures will be subject to tree article if they're part of an approval of a new subdivision. That has always been the case and will continue to be the case. There are also exemptions in our current ordinance for urban projects and transit station areas and uptown. Those exemptions are going away. That is a very big change that we want frequent users to know about, that in the future, there will be a requirement to comply with tree save or green areas, what we're calling it now, as a part of your development. They are currently in the current ordinance, they're required to do the tree planting and all the other things. They're really just exempt from tree save. But in the future, it will just apply across the board. You can go to the next slide. Green area is the new word we're using for tree save. In the current ordinance, we require commercial sites to save 15%, and single family can range from 10 to 5% tree save. In the new UDO, we're going to have a consistent percentage of tree save required for all sites. It'll be 15%. There will be some flexibility options that we'll talk about next, but that's a big change that we're making in the UDO. Next slide. And so if you're familiar with the current regulations, as I said earlier, we have a centers, quarters, and wedges framework that kind of divides the whole city up. Centers are your more high activity centers. Wedges are kind of your residential, the areas outside of our high commercial areas. And so there's a lot of considerations that go into what requirements apply to you in the tree article today. It considers zoning, it considers land use. And so in the future, where we're going to is each site in the city will be assigned a place type. And the place types will be put into this tiered approach where tier 1 place types, as you can see listed there, are going to have the most flexibility and the most options for compliance. And then tier 4 place types are going to have sort of the least. So it kind of mirrors what we're doing with centers, quarters, and wedges, but it simplifies it a lot more. And anyway, you can go to the next slide. You can see here the options that are available for green area. A couple of notes here. Tier 1 and tier 2 sites can use anything where there's a number listed here. If you see in this table that there's a number listed, that site in that place type can use that sort of flexibility option to meet green area. Tree save, you see, we have a lot of questions about, okay, are you getting rid of tree save? No. For any site, tree save can be used to meet your green area requirements. And then we added some incentives for higher quality trees. So if a development is saving trees on a steep slope or contiguous with another tree save area on a neighboring site, they're going to get higher credit because those are higher value trees and they're adding ecological benefits. Go to the next slide. So a really big component of the tree article is the heritage tree protection. And I think we talked at length about it in the previous presentation, so I'm not going to get into too much detail about why we're doing it. However, we want to answer some questions about what would be granted a permit in terms of heritage tree removal. And so you can see a couple scenarios highlighted here. It's important to note that if the tree is not native or it's not 30 inches diameter breast height, which is a pretty large tree, that's not a protected tree and that's not a heritage tree. So we're really going to talk about healthy 30-inch trees that are native to North Carolina. But if a tree is located in sort of an area where a proposed structure is being proposed and that structure can't be moved or that addition can't be moved, a permit would be granted with mitigation required. The tree location could conflict with a driveway or utilities. In that instance, we would grant heritage tree removal. If a tree is located in a way that it takes up about more than 49% of the lot's buildable area, that would also be granted. And then if it's important to note here that the tree, if the tree is dying or hazardous, that obviously could be removed without a permit. You could still come in for a permit. It would be good for us to know that that tree is being removed, but that permit would not be required. Next slide. And I'll hand that off now to Kevin May to talk about subdivision, streets, and infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I appreciate that. Good early afternoon, everybody. Kevin May, UDO team. I kind of spearheaded the subdivision streets and other infrastructure portion of the UDO. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch base on a few of the key concepts in the draft language in the UDO. Really, this one to let you know is we get a lot of our street network and connectivity through new collector and local streets, and we get that usually through development through the subdivision process. Going forward, that is going to continue. But also going forward, we're proposing a little bit of wider applicability for these kind of street requirements. And that's primarily due to a change in recent state law that allows that requirement for other types of zoning approvals, not just being subdivision only. And you can see there, I've left a reference for you there in the actual draft where you can go and kind of review and again, engage with us and give some comments and feedbacks with regard to this proposed language. Next slide. So that was touching base a little bit on new collectors and locals. And again, those are usually built by developers through the development process. Then we've also got a couple other types of streets, and those are arterials and limited access roads. And these are usually constructed by a public agency. Some of the language in the proposed UDO is requiring an 18-month reservation of the right-of-way for that corridor. That would be required reservation commencing at the land development approval. But we've also put some bonus language in there that if development chooses to dedicate that corridor space instead of reserving it, then in a neighborhood one place type, the minimum lot size may be reduced by 10%. And again, you can see there where the language is located in the draft UDO. Next slide. So in support of a lot of the language in the subdivision streets and infrastructure part of the UDO, and Laura talked about this earlier a little bit with the streets map, and the streets manual is really kind of the umbrella document for that streets map. And the UDO references the streets manual in several different places, but in a few key locations. One is the Charlotte streets map. And you can see the reference there, and that really defines the future cross sections of the arterial streets through the city. Also, the streets, the UDO references as part of the streets manual, the comprehensive transportation review. This is important, especially for those that are in neighborhoods, because this is really what's proposed to replace the city's current traffic impact study guidelines. So this is really the mechanism and the process by which development and the lens by which development will be looked at for potential mitigation of whatever development's impact may be for the surrounding transportation network. And then also as part of the streets manual will be driveway and access rules. And with each of these three key portions of the streets manual, the streets map, CTR, and the driveway and access rules, you can see there exactly where this language is located in the UDO. And just an important note, the streets manual with the streets map and the CTR, that is all part of the strategic mobility plan. Currently, that process is accepting public comment through the same time frame as the UDO, but it will also be adopted separately as a separate process from the UDO. Next slide. Just a little bit more on driveways and access, and really we've got regulations now. We've got regulatory language now regarding driveways and access, but we're incorporating that into the UDO. That really formalizes the review and approval of new or existing driveways. And again, this is good. The language in the draft UDO will reference the street manual for most driveway and access details, as well as for turn lane requirements. And you can see the reference to the draft language there as well. Next slide. Something very much talked about and rolled out as a new concept in SSI is this new concept of cross access. And this is really, some of you may be familiar with it just as it exists naturally in the physical environment, but this would be a required connection between adjacent properties or sites, trying to provide more safe, comfortable access for pedestrians, cyclists, and maybe just mitigate a little bit the traveling that is currently needed without that cross access of motor vehicles. Next slide. Also, we recognize that off-street parks and public paths are important to our connectivity. and mobility. And so another piece of the draft UDO is a public access to trails piece. As you can see there, the purpose is to allow for connectivity from a street to that park or off-street public path, thereby allowing increased public access to those facilities and increasing mobility and, again, access to those green and open spaces. This would be required depending on the length of the frontage of a property under development through a public access easement. And it's important to note that this access may also be combined with other required accesses for that property. Next slide. And then lastly, we've got a relocating curb and gutter section of the UDO, and that is also a new concept. Currently, this is usually achieved in the city through a TIS, a conditional rezoning, or a driveway plan approval. Going forward, this is proposed to apply to by right development, with the caveat that the requirements would be scaled to reflect project and location. And then in addition to that, the draft UDO, in conjunction with that scaling, also has some instances of exceptions and modifications. But just a note on that those exceptions or modifications would not override future curb locations as indicated by the Charlotte Streets map. And I think with that, that concludes my piece, and I'm going to hand it over to Sandra Montgomery, on the UDO team for administration.
Thank you, Kevin. I've been spearheading the administration articles, and I'm going to go over some of the key changes that are in those sections. Next slide. Creation of the UDO Administrator. This is new. Right now, in the middle of the screen, you can see the current administrators that we have now. There are 6 of them. The UDO Administrator's role would not be to supervise those existing administrators, but to administer the overall UDO. Another role of the UDO Administrator is to manage the UDO Board of Adjustment, which I'll talk about next, regarding variances and appeals. And the administrator would also resolve any conflicting regulations that are found in the UDO. Each of the other administrators administer the specific articles shown in the middle of the screen, and the UDO Administrator would administer Articles 1 through 2 and 36 through 40. Next slide. The UDO Board of Adjustment is also new. Currently, we have 3 bodies which review variances and appeals: the Zoning Board of Adjustment, Stormwater Advisory Committee, and the Charlotte Planning Commission. Moving forward, this will be assumed by a proposed UDO Board of Adjustment that will handle the variances and appeals, except recommended approval and denial for major watershed variance requests will go to the Watershed Commission, I believe it is, and the board would not be recommending, would not be actually making the approval or denial. Next slide. Another key change is that UDO Amendment Conditions will be expiring. Currently, any pending text amendments, petitions, or rezoning petitions that have not been decided, they can be pending for years. And with the proposed UDO, both of those petitions would expire if no decision is reached within 2 years of the submittal date. Next slide. The EX zoning district, which you're familiar with in the Todd zoning district now, as a mechanism to modify or alter minimum standards when the Todd standards can't be accommodated for a number of reasons that you see there on the screen. The current TODX does include a bonus menu of voluntary actions for obtaining additional building height, required reduction of required on-site open space, and an increase in the maximum building length. So what is proposed is, next slide. Moving forward, the EX district is going to be expanded into 13 zoning districts as a conditional process. And it will also be expanded not only to modify quantitative zoning standards, but also cross street cross-section standards when they can't be accommodated. The same reasons are that it might be a new development concept, an innovative design, or it might be a solution for special problems and other unique situations. In this district, the standards cannot be waived in their entirety. No modifications are allowed to the permitted uses or the maximum height regulations. And the development must provide public benefits, either in the sustainability category, a public amenity, or a city public improvement. More information on that can be found in section 38.2. Next slide. Another key change is the requirements for community meetings. Currently, only conditional zoning map amendments are required to have a community meeting, but that is proposed to be expanded to include all zoning map amendments, including conventional rezoning petitions. Next slide. Administrative adjustments. There's going to be some modifications here. Currently, zoning qualitative measurements can be adjusted up to 5% in the RE3, PED, and TS districts, and up to 10% in the TOD districts. For non-quantitative measurements, some minor alterations are allowed in the RE3, PED, and TS districts if it's a innovative design approach that also aligns with the intent of the district. Zoning adjustments can also be approved currently for handicap ramps, encroachments compliant with ADA standards, or encroachments for historic features on an existing structure in a historic district. Next slide. Moving forward, the administrative adjustment is proposed to be up to 10% of the quantitative standards for both zoning and tree standards. There'll be no adjustments for bonus provisions, density, signs, or conditions on an approved conditional or EX site plan. Again, administrative adjustments, as before, can be approved for encroachments, handicap ramps, and also up to a 2-foot adjustment is permitted for frontages, side and rear setbacks, and landscape yards that meet those same conditions for approval. Another new item is a notification of abutting property owners so that they know there's an administrative adjustment in the works, and there are conditions for approval of an administrative adjustment. Next slide. And last, there are broadened permit choice rules. Currently, when a permit application is submitted for development, and after that's submitted, but before a decision is reached, an ordinance is amended, then the applicant can choose which version of that ordinance, either the older one or the new one, that applies to the application and use of land. This was amended back in June of last year. Moving forward, the same situation for single development permits will apply, as well as if the development requires multiple permits, the applicant can choose which version of the amended ordinance will apply at the time that the initial permit comes in. That version choice then would apply to subsequent permit applications submitted within 18 months of approval from the original initial permit. And with that, next slide, I'm going to send it back to Laura Harmon for comment.
Thank you, Sandy. We have gotten some questions about how things will transition from the current regulations to the UDO. Want to be transparent about where we are today in our thinking, and that we will have more information on this in the upcoming months. We are currently looking at the effective date. We have a number of other ways to transition that may or may not impact the effective date. So the translation obviously occurs and would apply the zoning translation on the effective date. Sandy just talked about permit choice. and we're looking at how that would apply. And we also were looking at conditional rezonings that are in process at the time of adoption and are letting those move forward under the current regulations. So again, the questions that we got, the date the UDO will possibly go into effect. Right now, we're looking at a few months after adoption. But again, that's continuing to be something we look at and we'll be asking for some feedback on. The transition process will really follow the permit choice rules, and locking in the current ordinance as the transition to the UDO occurs would happen if someone submitted a permit in advance of the changes and approval occurred afterwards, or with a conditional rezoning. So hand this off to Mariah, and she's going to finish out the meeting for us.
Thank you, Laura. I'm just going to quickly run through some UDO resources that will be helpful. So if this virtual conversation piqued your interest and you'd like to dig into the UDO even more than you already have, we encourage you to check out our website, so charlotteudo.org. And that's where you will find our platform to make comments, and you can do so by section. And so, like Laura spoke to earlier, we really encourage you to leave those comments there if something here is really spoken to you. We also have a 26-page reference guide that's available on our website. This document is meant to help you find information specific to certain topics or zoning districts that you need info about. It also breaks down some of the regulatory concepts that may not be familiar to everyone. Our website is also the gateway to our recently released Choose Your Interest educational videos. These videos discuss what the draft UDO means for different scenarios. We have a video aimed at explaining what the UDO could mean for existing neighborhoods, new neighborhoods, existing businesses, and new development. We really encourage you to check those out and also share them with your network. So just to summarize, our first UDO draft was released in October, and we will be accepting comments through the portal on our website through March 18th. We will also be hosting additional virtual conversation opportunities beginning in February through mid-March. Potential topics there include short-term rentals, heritage trees, parking, and we're still kind of finalizing the list of topics and the schedule based on the information we're hearing and the comments that we are receiving from the community. And then Andrew spoke to this a bit when he spoke in stormwater and natural resources, but all of our past virtual conversations, which you see here, are recorded and they can be found on our website. They were an hour in length and focused on a specific topic. They took place from December, and then our last one was rescheduled from before, but is happening now. So we definitely encourage you to check out those as well. And they can be found at charlotteudo.org as well. And with that, that concludes our presentation. So we just want to thank you all for being here. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.